usually in the same space, but today we're not. So, so thank you. Before we get officially started, I thought that we would have Andrew start us off with a little bit of Earth Day trivia. So Andrew, you want to start us off from DPW?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Andrew Gershon, DPW. I'm the legislative and policy analyst here. My trivia question was, what United States president signed the Earth Day bill into law? It might surprise you.
Yeah, come off mute if you want to answer that question. First one to say it gets the prize.
Is it Bill Clinton?
Nope.
No.
Nixon?
Nixon, correct. Richard Nixon, 1970. Signed the Earth bill. Probably wouldn't happen today from, certain presidents, but Richard M. Nixon, of all people, signed the Earth Day bill into law in 1970.
I only guessed that because I know he created the EPA, so I just assumed.
Yeah, and then the Clean Water Act a couple years later, 1972. So
It was a different era back then.
Yeah.
Era of cooperativeness that we don't necessarily have today.
A little bit of housekeeping. Thank you, Andrew. That was fun. Nick, I'm sorry, Vermesia and her team cannot get in. The password's not working. So maybe if someone can send them some information, that'd be helpful. And I'll give a little bit of a delay until they jump on because Vermesia is one of our presenters today from HCMA.
I think she might be tag teaming with a couple of other staff from HCMA. I think I see.
Right, and they're all waiting to try to get in.
All right,
I'll
we'll try
respond
to
to
fix
her.
that. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, Nick, are we all set? Were you able to take care?
Just about to hit send. So
Okay. And then we can get started because the first two slides are not pertinent to their their presentation. So with that, I just want to welcome everyone. Again, look at that, Adria. Happy Earth Day. We are, we are able to celebrate today actually because the weather's so beautiful. So hopefully you all get out and enjoy all the beauty that DC has to offer and be grateful and thankful that we are such a green city and we are doing so many things to push towards that 2032 clean energy goals that we have set. So happy Earth Day. So we'll have a brief introduction. It's just our recap for anyone that's joining us for the first time. We want to make sure that people understand what this Flood Task Force is doing and why we are convened. We'll have a recap of our public listening sessions that were held last month in March. We will also talk about the infrastructure project funding list, which we've been talking about over the course of, the last few meetings, but we want to give you an update and a culmination of things and then a call to action so that you can continue to do this work so that we can have a great list and identify projects that we want to start to pursue. Then we'll have, like I said, Vermesia and her team will be very much a part of this presentation because we're going to talk about the emergency operations framework and the planning overview. And we'll have a brief discussion about that as well. It may or may not take 45 minutes. It depends on how many questions we have, but of course, we'll be open for that. And then we'll close it out. As always, we'll give a little homework and give you some updates on the next meetings that we're going to have in the future. Thank you. So I do want to just mention that today's meeting is being recorded. And so it will be archived on our Flood Task Force website. But in 2021, in September 2021, the city administrator convened this flood task force in response to the September flood of that same year. So the flood task force reports to the deputy mayor of operations and infrastructure, which is Dean Waugh. And we have two co-chairs, the CEO for DC Water, Mr. Gaddis, and the director for DOEE, Mr. Wells. We kicked off our first meeting in November of 2021. And as I mentioned, all proceedings are open to the public. We do have recordings of our meetings as well as minutes that are archived on our website, which is dcfloodtaskforce.org. Again, all one word, dcfloodtaskforce.org. Next slide. So we do have a very robust schedule. We meet frequently, but it's not all things at the same time. So we do have a little bit of a nuance to our schedule. The full task force meets every other month on the third Wednesday. And then we'll have our next full task force meeting on Wednesday, April 16th. I'm sorry, that already passed. We'll have our next task force in, I think it's May, or is it June? I'm not sure. Adria, is it May or June?
Apologies. The next task force meeting is May 18th.
Great. So we also, thank you, Adria. The action teams, which are basically subcommittees, were broken up in two action teams. They meet every month. This is one of them. Residential resilience is on the second Tuesday of the month, and the governance and coordination is on the second Friday of the month. This is a rescheduled meeting, so we're not doing it because last week was Emancipation Day. So we rescheduled for this week. The Flood Task Force final report that we're all working towards is due in November of 2022, and we must have an action plan for each of the 9 categories that we are talking about in our action team meetings. We will have after the final report is submitted, this task force will meet annually and we'll track progress on the action plan, and we'll also continue to discuss budgeting priorities. Next slide. So as I mentioned, we do have 2 action teams with 9 categories that we cover. Residential resilience goes through categories 1 through 4. We'll have our next meeting on May 10th. And governance and coordination go through categories 5 through 9. Next slide, please. So for our recap of public listening sessions and the feedback, we'll go ahead and get into that now. So our public listening session recaps, we had 2 sessions and they were held virtually. The first one was on March 28th from 11 to 12:30, which was midday to capture, residents that had, some time during their lunch to join us for a conversation. We had about 22 participants in a very good conversation. We were a few concerns were brought to our attention as well as some ideas and suggestions. So that was a great session, as was the March 31st session from 6 to 7:30. Again, we try to have the times meet the needs, meet the availability of the public. And we had about 21% participants at that meeting. Again, more great input, feedback, and comments and concerns were shared. A little bit later in the presentation, we'll talk about how we've captured and documented that information and how we're responding back to the public so that it's fully, the process is full and complete. Next slide, please. So with the public listening session feedback, we heard lots of different things. Here's some of the information here is listed, but in particular, we heard things about people that are greatly concerning, about people paying up to $15,000 for some of the flood damage in their basements or in their households, and only receiving out of that $15,000 that they spent, only receiving $3,000 in damage relief. So it's stories like that that really give us the energy behind solving some of these problems and making it right for the residents of the District of Columbia so that they're not, out of pocket for these large expenses. Next slide, please.
Actually, Monty, Adria, can you go back one slide? I just want to highlight 3 items, I think specifically for the governance action team. So the first bullet point, residents don't always know who to call in a flood. That's kind of related to one of the action categories in this group. The 4th bullet point, residents want to know all the infrastructure projects occurring in the city and if there's a central location That's something that we'll be talking about shortly, the infrastructure project list. And then let's see, the third from the bottom, residents express wanting more consistent stormwater maintenance. I think this is kind of related to the drainage committee discussions that we've started to have, and in general, the governance coordination that we need to do amongst ourselves, because there's not always one agency responsible for that. So I just thought I'd highlight three things that the public is telling us is really important that are very clearly related to the actions that this team is supposed to work on.
And thank you, Nick, because my eyes were tricky here. I see that those are highlighted. So thank you for chiming in. It's a full teamwork effort here. So thanks a lot. The next slide. Did you want to talk about this next slide, Nick?
No, go for it.
Okay. All right. So we have created a spreadsheet, a tracking spreadsheet so that we can, one, capture the public's input, concerns, questions, and then make sure that we are responding with some kind of action. So we have captured here the resident. We are, just using initials. We log their question or their concern, and then we have the agency responsible. Those agencies will get this information and they will then respond to the resident. And if there's any particular action that the flood task force needs to take, we'll log that as well. Next slide, please. So with that, the infrastructure project funding list and call to action, this will be Alan Prop from DMWA's office. Alan?
Yeah, thank you, Monte. So what I want to do here is kind of quickly overview some of the federal funding sources that are available for flood infrastructure projects, both some of the ones that were introduced or, re-upped in the bipartisan infrastructure law this past year, as well as some of the ones that have been going on consistently for a while. And then I'll turn us to the current status of the infrastructure project list in DC. So as you see here, the good news is there is an increasing recognition of flood protection and flood resilience at the federal level as kind of critically important going forward. And that recognition is happening across a number of federal agencies. So I'll just highlight a few that are popping up here that I thought were worth calling out in this slide that were in the bipartisan infrastructure law. So one, the U.S. Department of Transportation has these two protect programs, one formula and one competitive. And these numbers, I think, are what are appropriated in FY22, the federal government FY22. So these, as would be expected from US DOT, are transportation related, but as you know, a lot of flood resilience projects are transportation related. So this is a really big opportunity for flood work and flood resilience to piggyback on some of our transportation projects and possibly apply some funds to some flood funds to that. Environmental Protection Agency has this consistent clean water state revolving fund, which is managed by DOEE and distributed in grants. And I believe that application period for other agencies is open right now. So that is a DOEE administered program. And then there's kind of this other small pot on sewer overflow and stormwater reuse. FEMA has a really big competitive grant program. This is something I think we should look really critically at. This is almost $3 billion in flood mitigation assistance grants and building resilient infrastructure and communities, BRIC. This is a really big grant program with a big opportunity for flood protection work. Army Corps of Engineers has a couple of competitive grant programs as well on aquatic ecosystems and environmental infrastructure. The Department of Agriculture has smaller competitive grant programs, but still, sizable enough to be worth looking at and applying for, and watershed flood prevention and emergency watershed protection. And finally, the Department of Commerce has some flood forecasting and mapping funds, as well as habitat restoration. And those are both competitive grant programs. And I'll note this is a sampling. There's a lot more in the bipartisan infrastructure law that, I picked some of the programs that were towards the core of what would apply directly to flood work, but flood work is a lot of things. So there are a lot of other programs that flood work could probably piggyback onto or be part of an application for. And then if you could go to the next slide, there are some other programs that have been consistently going for a while now and have just been re-upped. FEMA programs on hazard mitigation and community assistance are some key ones I would call out. A number of NOAA programs as well as community development block grants from HUD. And then FHWA, I should have mentioned when I was talking about Department of Transportation, but this is a program that's been going on a while that provides funds to DDOT that are good opportunities as well to critically look at what projects we're funding through the State Transportation Program and see where flood work can be integrated. And the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is a consistent partner. So taking a step back on this, I think a couple of things I would want to point out. So one, as I mentioned earlier, this is a very multi-agency effort at the federal level, and therefore is going to be a really multi-agency effort at the district government level, the state government level as well. So we should be thinking across agencies as to what projects should be applied to flood infrastructure and flood resilience. Number two, if you can you just go back one slide, just so we can see those dollar amounts. There is a massive amount of money out there, but a lot of it is in competitive programs. So what that means is we're going to have to be prepared as this funding applications become available. We're going to have to be prepared with a ready and prioritized set of projects that are both shovel ready and shovel worthy. So our projects that are ready to be implemented, but also are high priorities and provide deep resilience for frontline, low income and community of color. It's going to be really important that those projects are ready to be put in grant applications. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to tap into these massive pots of money at the federal level. And the last thing I'll mention is this funding is not going to be enough. I think this funding plus our local funding is still going to leave a huge gap in the funding that we're going to need to consider DC flood ready and flood resilient. And that is part of the work that we're doing as the Flood Task Force, is trying to understand the size of that gap and start to attack, how are we going to chip away at that gap and get the funding that we need to build our flood resilience. So if we can go ahead 2 slides. Thanks. Sorry, Adria, I know I'm having you skip around, but this is the infrastructure list that we've been developing. I know it is tiny. I think you can zoom in on WebEx, but if you can't, no worries. The details aren't critical to see during this meeting. Basically, what we're doing is developing this infrastructure list, and I want to just say huge thanks to EJ and Ravi from DDOT for meeting with us earlier this week to start to input some of those, both the status, funding source, and the cost estimate range for some of the DDOT projects. So our goal here is particularly in that cost estimate column to just start getting a sense for what is the world of costs that we're going to need to cover in order to take care of these flood infrastructure projects, and when are we planning on starting construction on them. So this is kind of the homework assignment. And, we've reached out a few times, and I think we'll be continuing to reach out. But if you see your agency under lead agency in this second column, it is your job to add in the details on the cost estimate particularly, but also earliest construction start, funding source, and status. To add that information in so that we can then start to generate an overall cost range, ideally broken down by year, for the funding gap that we're going to need to recover. And that'll help us apply for competitive grants. That'll help us use our formula grants, and it'll help us start thinking about what are other funding sources we can tap into or create for ourselves to work on flood infrastructure projects. So I will wrap up and pause for any kind of questions or additions from the DOE or DC Water team, with just saying that please, if you see your agency as a lead agency here, take a look at this, ideally today or early next week, and start adding in the details for your project, even if it's early stage or you don't know the exact funding amount. We're hoping that these rough ranges, the 0 to 10, 10 to 25, 25 to 50 million ranges, are broad enough that we can start getting a finger in the wind understanding of the costs that we're going to need to cover here. DOE team, DC Water team, anything you would add or correct in what I've said?
Yeah, you're right on. And we're developing that list, going through our CIP program, not just for the 10 years, but 20 years out to add to this list. Quick question. Is there a consolidated approach between DC agencies on applying for this infrastructure money so that there's somebody centrally that understands who's applying and what are they applying for, so there's no conflicts?
Yeah, it's a great question, Salil. And the answer is that is in progress. So we have partly been developing an early understanding of that kind of centrally within the DC government, just trying to get our arms around what is the scope of programs available. So that's kind of half the answer. The other half is that there is the DC Build Back Better Infrastructure Task Force that Mayor Bowser announced, I believe, last month, that is going to be working on pulling together, not only DC agency leads and DC Water and a lot of the utilities, but also members of the community to start developing priorities for funding. So that, I think, is basically being launched last month and this month, and it's going to start meeting shortly. So that will also be a really key source of prioritizing funding amounts or funding projects.
Thank you.
So for Sandra's question, can we get a copy of the list? Everyone who's on the task force should have gotten an email last week. It was like April task force roundup, something like that. And in that there is a link to the spreadsheet, and so that's what we're looking at here. There's multiple tabs in the spreadsheet, and this one is, I think, just called infrastructure list. So that's how you can look at that. I don't want to put it in the chat just because I want to make sure it's in case. I don't think we want this to be like publicly editable, which it would be if I put it in the chat. But I think for folks that are getting the emails on the official task force list, you'll be able to access it that way. And I think for Julia's question, yeah, I mean, definitely some of these are federally led, and we have a couple, like Joint Base Anacostia Bowling and Naval Research Laboratory. I'm guessing those are for the levies over there. I think we want to include them and note the cost and the funding source and earliest construction date. I think we want to include them, how they will be ranked and stacked according to, the DC Flood Task Force. I think that's a question for later, but I think we want to, at least for now, just have a really broad list that includes anything in the District of Columbia that could.
Yeah, I'll second what Nick is saying. The goal is to get the big picture here of what the flood protection needs are. So I think it's beneficial. This is a very minimal amount of information, so I don't think would be revealing anything. But if we can just capture that to show how great the need is.
Yeah, I think this is Julia. I just wanted to know, because I don't know that we have all the different federal actors on this. I don't know if Stacy's on the call, but it might require a little like digging on our end. So I just wanted to double check that.
Yeah, if you don't know the information, maybe we just put TBD.
Yeah,
Uh,
well, it'll even be helpful if you like if you know there is a project, but you know like it's Park Service or whatever, and you know you just haven't had a chance to contact them about it. If you just put the line, you know, just so that we know like, oh hey, there's something here, and we can follow up too. So feel, you know, this is an editable document, so feel free to just add rows and put it in there, and then we'll kind of clean it up once folks have made their additions.
Okay, and this is Stacy Underwood with the Quarry. I'll go ahead and fill in as much as I can on some of those projects. Maybe put some question marks if needed.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you, Stacy. Thank you, Julia. Yeah, and maybe I'll just I'll add, I think Alan kind of framed this really well. One thing that, you know, I'm personally a little worried about is that we all are hearing every day about how much money is in this infrastructure bill, and you know it can be used for, you know, like why couldn't it be used for flood risk infrastructure? And I think the reality is, you know, a small portion of all that money is going to be specifically available for flood risk. And then, as Alan mentioned, a lot of it's going to be competitive. So we're going to be competing with every state and every city for, you know, our share of the dollars. And, you know, I think that means two things is number one, the infrastructure funding is not going to be the silver bullet to getting all of this paid for. I think we're still going to need conversations on whether and how much local money we want to spend on this. But the other thing is, in order to be competitive for these grants, we need to have this list, and we need to in some cases we need to work on designs, and we need to be really clear about what our needs are, because the application timelines, they always come way quicker than you think. And then you know, we have lots of ideas on here, some of which aren't close to being shovel ready or even designed, and so they won't even be eligible. So, you know, I think I'm just trying to temper expectations a little bit about the giant pot of money that the federal government is handing out right now, and saying that it's, you know, it's not all, we can't just think that we're going to grab it all and spend it on flooding, because there's a lot of other you know, specific criteria that you have to meet too.
Yeah, and Nick, I think that's a great point, and I think it's kind of a challenge, but also a really big opportunity. I think, you know, the challenging side, I think the default is, you know, a notice of funding opportunity is announced, and whoever, you know, states, government agencies kind of just quickly work together to throw together an application and submit it and hope they get funding. And the opportunity here is that we have had this flood task force together in advance of the bipartisan infrastructure law. So we have a ready-made group that is thoughtfully thinking about which projects are going to be worthy and competitive for federal funding. So that is a really big opportunity for us to be a little bit more thoughtful in advance of our applications. But that is a challenge, because this is the group that's going to have to do that. So this, I think, is a really important step that we're asking you all to take in, let's get this master list so that when these notices of funding opportunities come out, we're not scrambling and we're not just pulling what's on the top of the shelf, but we're actually looking and saying, what's a reasonable project that fits with this opportunity, rather than just what's ready or what's available.
Hey, Alan, coming back to that discussion about federal funding. My understanding was federal entities are not eligible to ask for funding from this bill. It's only the states and DC.
Yeah, I think that's correct. Did I say something that led to?
No.
Oh,
Just,
okay.
we
Yeah.
do want to gather this list of projects, and we do want to show it on a map so that the public sees where there's projects, even if it's not planned, I mean, it's not in design yet, that there's plan for a project in some area. So it really helps to show that all these projects on a map.
That's everything I had for this section, unless there are kind of additional questions. Otherwise, I think we can leave it with the homework assignment of filling in the details for your infrastructure projects on this list. And if there are any projects that you see that are still missing on this list, adding that project in as well as the details.
Thank you, Alan. Great. So we're going to move forward with the next presentation on the emergency operations and planning from HCEMA. So Vermesia and her team, will you please share your presentation?
And maybe while they're getting on, I can just share. You know, we talked with HCEMA in advance, and you know, basically what you see here, these are a couple of the action ideas for Category 9, and you know, I think specifically if you look at 9.1, 9.2, you know, and then just in general. Yeah, I think especially 9.2, procedures and agency roles for emergency flooding response. We felt like this was something we needed to talk a little bit more about as an action team. And so we're going to have a couple of folks from HCEMA kind of lay out the way things work right now in HCEMA, and then we can have a group discussion about, you know, what we need to change, if anything, and what we need to be putting in an action plan. So.
Yeah. Monty, do you have our slide? It should be the next one. Okay, great. Emily, without further ado. So.
All right, good morning. Thank you. So just going to give you guys sort of a quick overview of our planning framework and a little bit of how that might be applicable to the work that you're doing. And just sort of for context, I know you guys are talking a lot about the infrastructure projects and the mitigation activities and all of that. And a lot of what this planning construct is geared toward is really sort of the response and sort of immediate protection activities. So just for context, that's kind of where this part is focused. And so the two sort of main buckets that our plans break down into, our emergency plans, are service plans and mission plans. And services are sort of the really discrete activities that each of the district agencies do, the services they provide either to other agencies or to the public in an emergency situation. And in this sort of complicated graphic over on the right, I hope you guys can see it okay. You can see sort of some examples of what those might be. And these are notional for sort of explanatory purposes, but you get sort of an idea of what we're talking about. And in those plans, we talk about who owns the service. Each one is owned by an individual agency who really defines how that works and then directs its execution in an emergency. It has a concept of operations, so sort of the critical steps and phases associated with delivering that service. It has a target. How much of it do we want to be able to do? So if you were to take the shelter operations service as an example, we want to put a target on that. We don't just want to be able to shelter people. We want to be able to shelter 200 people within 6 hours of an incident and maintain that for 1 week or something like that, right? So we have a measurable goal for the delivery of that service, which helps us resource it, which is the next bullet on there. And the next piece of the service plan is, what are the resources? What are the plans, the teams, the equipment, the training that we need in order to be able to deliver that service when an emergency occurs and it's time to turn that on? So those are about 6 to 10 page plans. They're high level. They're not operational. It's not what you're going to take as your reference guide when you go out into the field to execute one of these services, but it's sort of the awareness level version of how that service operates. And again, that list of resources that allows us to operate that service when it's time. And the second piece is mission plans. And missions are services working together towards a common goal. So if you look over on the right, you see the sheltering mission in the middle there. And certainly shelter operations is part of that, but we need security at the shelters. So we turn on a site security mission. If, if people are potentially in need of medical assistance, we might do medical assessments as people come into the shelters. We might have a feeding service at the shelter. So it's all those different services that are driven by different agencies working together towards a common goal. The services are the most discrete level of that, and then missions are describing how those services work together to support either other agencies or the community. I'm going to go to the next slide. So this is a lot of boxes on the page, and I apologize for that, but this is really sort of the full hierarchy of how our plans come together. So in the red box there, we have our emergency operations plan, which is the primary emergency plan for the district. It describes sort of at a high level how we all work together to prepare for and respond to an emergency. And so the service plans live as annexes to that overall emergency operations plan. So they're cataloged as annexes to that plan. And then when we need to build our services, or I'm sorry, our mission plans, we have all of those services sort of as the menu of things that we can pull from to combine to create those mission plans. And then under each of those service plans, as I said, those are like, they're high level, right? They're awareness level plans. Under each of those, you have an operational plan, which gives you the details of how you actually execute that service. So those are going to be longer, they're going to be more operational, they're going to be more sort of descriptive of the activities and how those activities are executed. And then under each of those, there are tactical plans, your SOPs, your toolkits that really give the operators the how-to of execution. So it's the base plan at the top level, then the service plans, and then getting into more detailed versions of execution plans as we drill down into each of those capabilities. And then up at the top, we have threat and hazard playbooks, and we have mission plans. So as we talked about before, the service plans can be combined together into mission plans, and then we can turn on various missions in response to threat and hazards. And so those threats and hazards have playbooks associated with them that say, essentially, if this thing happens, consider turning on these missions. And when you turn on those missions, consider turning on these services, so that we have a sort of pre-scripted menu of what we might want to do in response to any given threat or hazard. And on the next slide, we have a super high level example. I think it's a hurricane. So in response to a hurricane, that playbook might say, we're going to need incident management, we're going to need sheltering, we're going to need damage assessment, we're going to need debris management, and all of the services that live below that. And you see in this example, I have red boxes around some of them. So we may choose not to turn on debris because we don't need that. So we're just turning on the first three, and we're only turning on some services in those first three. Later, we might escalate and turn on debris management or not, but it's still included in the playbook because it's something we know we're going to need to consider. And so with that playbook, we talk about the definition of the threat or hazard, the mission statement, the checklists, that menu that we talked about, the concept of operations, which again, the major tasks, the phases of execution, impacts, courses of action, and then the critical information that we need to know to be able to execute that mission, those services. So this is sort of the anatomy of these threat and hazard playbooks. And so for purposes of this group, we might have a flood fighting playbook or a flood response playbook or something to that effect, and then identifying those missions and services that we would want to activate in response to a flooding incident at varying levels of severity. At a super high level, that's kind of the overview of the planning construct for the district at this point. So I will pause there. I'm done with the planning overview, and see if anyone has any questions.
Emily, this is fantastic. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Do you see flood as being a subsection of the hurricane playbook? Because hurricanes will result in flooding also.
It very well could be. It may be that we have a flood playbook in its own right that we might activate in a hurricane as well. There's nothing that says we can't turn on two of these playbooks at the same time. Or as we work through a planning process around flood, we might decide that flood fighting, flood response is a mission as opposed to a whole playbook. And so then it would be a mission under the hurricane playbook or another severe weather playbook that might result in a flooding incident. There's a lot of flexibility to kind of work within the construct, however it works best for the specific activities associated with that response.
This is fantastic. My interface is only from what I see on television, so forgive me for ignorance, but sheltering. So I understand in fires out west or what happens in hurricanes, there are temporary shelters opened up. Is there a time limit on how long those can all be operated? If somebody gets displaced from, say, a basement apartment because it's totally trashed because of water.
Yeah, so that is, it's something that we would work out in the sort of in the planning process, right? So the DHS as the lead for shelter would look at sort of the likelihood of a number of people who might be displaced and how long they might need that support. And they would create in their plan that target to say, we want to be able to support this many people for this amount of time. And then we'd look to resource around that. There are some regulations and policies and things that would guide that. And I don't have the specifics of that in front of me, but from a planning perspective, it's that target piece is where we would really want to define how much and for how long we're able to offer these services.
It's awesome. Thank you.
So Emily, I was wondering, can you go back, or I guess Adria, can you go back to the slide with yeah, go back one more. Okay, I'm just looking at the flood fighting mission 1, and you have under there sandbag operations, levee operations.
Yeah, and
Are those services?
They're there as examples of what services might be. Those are not necessarily existing services in the district's planning construct. Full disclosure, this is a relatively new framework for us. We're getting ready to finalize the emergency operations base plan now. We just finished the sort of comment period on it. So we're still working through defining some of these services. Some of them are complete and some of them are still in progress, which is actually really great because it gives us the flexibility to work within this sort of flood context to continue to flesh that out. So they're there as examples. They may be services that we end up writing, they may not be. But for now, they're there as a notional consideration.
Okay, so maybe to understand where you guys are in the process is you've agreed on the structure. So I guess if you go to the next slide, Adria, you've agreed on the structure of yeah, so like an overall emergency operations plan with service plans under it. Is that what you're saying? Like that's relatively new.
Yes, and we do have some of the services finalized. So like
okay.
GC Water has a water infrastructure management service plan, which would probably be applicable to this setting. And there are some others as well. And I can sort of work with Ramesia to get you guys a list of the ones that we have already in progress that may be applicable to this process. And then we can look sort of more holistically at what might be missing and if there's any additional that we need to work to develop.
Okay. And I don't know if this is if you guys don't have this information, that's fine, but can you just walk us through the service plan operational tactical, for example, of like, I don't know, the sandbag one, or even if you don't have one, just like what would be in it?
Yeah, so the service plan, again, it's very high level. They're short, they're sort of reference guides so that if I'm trying to define a mission or engage in a response, I have an understanding of what the various services are that we may want to offer, right? So super high level, done for sort of preparedness purposes, and then as a reference in a response. And then the operational plans get more into like who does what. So the easiest example for me to reference to get a little bit more tactical is one of our own, like we have an incident management coordination service plan that basically says, in an incident, we're going to turn on the EOC, we're going to conduct a series of meetings, we're going to, do these various things to convene folks to coordinate a response. Then our operational plans, there are a couple, but one of them is our EOC manual. And so it doesn't just say, we're going to convene these calls. It says this person is going to convene this call after this thing happens with these people. This is the agenda. This is how that works. And then the tactical plans are much more SOP level. Like here's an invite list, and here's who's, this is the template for the notes, and this is, who's actually putting fingers to keyboards on writing some of these response plans. So it drills down into more descriptive and more actionable plans as you go down sort of in that hierarchy, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's helpful.
Yeah, can I ask to just, I guess, drill a little deeper or figure out how we can fit this into the work we're doing with the task force. So I've reviewed some of these plans over the past years. So are you still, do the plans that are out there now, like the response, the preparedness framework, the response plan, the recovery plan, are those still applicable? And then you're working on the lower levels?
So they are still applicable now. I mentioned we're getting ready to release an updated emergency operations plan, and that will actually replace the current district response plan.
Okay.
And some of the short-term recovery components of the recovery plan.
Okay. And I believe that there is a flood response plan that's been drafted. Was it finalized? Or is
I don't know for sure if it was finalized, and I think from what I've seen, that would be in this sort of operational plan level.
Yeah.
So we would want to look at that again and see sort of which, based on the services we've defined and the services we're continuing to define, which of those are applicable to that operational plan. And one of the reasons that we're looking at this service level, and in some cases where we have an operational plan, sort of reverse engineering into the service plans, is because we want to make sure we're consistent from plan to plan. So if we did a flood response plan that included a sheltering component and separately did a hurricane response plan that included a sheltering component, we want to make sure that those sheltering components match, right? Because it's essentially the same service. So those service plans really serve as a reference point to make sure that when we're doing operational planning and we're saying we're going to shelter people, or we're going to we're going to do site security, we're saying it the same way in each plan, so we're not making conflicting or incorrect assumptions about the way that service might be offered. So that's one of the reasons that those service plans sort of come into play when we get into the operational planning, is to keep us consistent and make sure our assumptions are correct about what those activities will look like in response to any given event.
Yeah, this is great and super helpful. Could we try to create a specific flow chart or flow diagram for flooding?
Absolutely.
To see, from the highest level down to the lowest service plan, operational plans, tactical plans, what we want to have, what exists, what you're planning to put together, and then what we can review and provide input to.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's sort of the initial outline of what a flood response playbook might look like. So yes, we can certainly go through the existing plans that we have and put together that sort of hierarchy, and then see where we have gaps or questions, and where we might need to develop some additional plans for preparedness purposes.
Great.
And we might
Yeah,
need
this
to
is
have.
Stacey Underwood with the Corps. I did just want to mention that, HCEMA is, I guess, leading an exercise in June for flooding. So I think a lot of this will I imagine they're probably working on this. I know the DC Silver Jackets team is supporting that effort. I haven't personally been involved, but my belief is that they'll be, looking at all these plans that are out there and can help,
that
lay this
exercise
out
is
like Meredith asked.
Yeah, it's in the fairly early stages of planning, but yes, that's certainly part of what we're planning to do for that as well. So I think it'll come together really nicely in supporting that exercise as well as your efforts here.
Stacy, did you say it was this summer?
Yeah, this is the one.
I thought it was going to be June. I don't know if there's a date set, but maybe that's been pushed. I don't know.
This is the one we got Dusty involved in, Salil.
So I'm just wondering if it's this June, would this be at least in a draft form to be presented for flooding by June?
Yeah, that would be the hope, is that we would have at least the draft of it to be able to exercise against, or drafts of components of it that we're able to exercise against.
One thought on I'm guessing you probably want an interior flooding playbook and then a separate coastal riverine flooding playbook, just because the warning times are so different.
Would those be different mission plans and different playbooks?
I'm not quite sure what terminology you should be using, but there is a distinction between.
Sure.
Yeah.
This is great. Thank you, Emily.
Absolutely. I think
I guess some follow-on questions. So what should the individual agencies be doing? Are individual agencies already tied into this effort in other ways? Or is there something that this task force could do to help this effort?
So we've been working with all of the agencies who own these services, which ends up being a pretty broad group of agencies in the district. So one of the components that we saw on the previous slide that laid out the service plan elements was the owner. So each of these is really owned and driven by a single agency. So we wanted at that level of granularity where we really have the agencies sort of driving what their activities are. So over the course of the last, it's been probably 18 months, a couple of years now, we've been working with the agencies to identify what these services are and start drafting them out. So those agencies who own services have been involved in these processes and are certainly continuing to vet them. But one of the critical components of the planning process is the agencies working together to understand that interaction and that collaboration as well. So once we have these services fleshed out, and even with the drafts that we have so far, we will be working with the agencies collaboratively to build these mission plans and to build the threat and hazard playbooks. So that really is the collaborative component, but because the service plans really serve as the building blocks for a lot of that, we've been focusing our effort there to get those to a point where we can start working with them. So we have been engaging with the agencies. We will continue to do that going forward, and it'll get much more collaborative as we move to the sort of multi-service plans. And I think, and I'll defer to Vermesia a little bit on this as well, but I think as we get into some of that flood mission or flood threat and hazard playbook planning, I think this group or members of this group would be really critical in sort of ensuring that we're considering all of the components that go into that.
I'll put a question out to the group because I know there's a lot of people in our agencies and we work on lots of different things. Just to say, hey, agencies that are on the call, DPW, DDOT, OP, DGS, DPR, are you all, whoever is in your agency who's working on these flood issues, are you tuned in or know who from your agency is working on the emergency response development with HCEMA? Just to make sure that those connections are made.
You can come off mute or you don't have to come off video, but you can come off mute and respond to Meredith. We have everybody off mute or mute
Well,
enabled.
while people are considering that, I'll drop my email in the chat, and I think you all have Vermesia's contact as well. If you don't know who at your agency has been engaged in any of these planning efforts, certainly let me know, and I can make sure that you're connected to that person and you know who the point person is for some of this planning. So happy to help with those connections, and certainly interested in getting sort of the broadest agency perspective that we can as we continue to develop these. So encourage you to both to reach out to them and participate in those conversations as well.
Actually, Emily, would it be good for you to just share that contact chain, and then we could send it out to the full task force? If you send it to, Meredith and Nick and Salil, that could be a better way of us pushing it all out and saying, hey, this is your agency contact. Is there somebody else that should be included?
Yeah,
That'd
I
be
can see if we
helpful.
can get that together.
Great. Thank you so much. Meredith, did you have more
Thank you very
questions?
much. I don't. Just want to
Okay.
make sure the group has opportunity to chime in.
Yeah.
Right. Those were great questions that you were asking. Did anybody else from the task force, this action team, have any questions for HCMA? All right. Well, we will continue to move forward. I'm sorry, is this you, Meredith, or Nick?
No, I think this is still HCMA, but they may be switching presenters.
Hey, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yes, sorry, thank you.
How you doing? Just want to thank Emily for the presentation. As we start talking about, what happened on September 10th, I know Reese is going to be helping me with this, but a lot of the planning framework and considerations that Emily was talking about weren't in place at the time. But since then, we've developed it, and like she said, we're going to be rolling it out. But as many of you know, on September 10th, 2020, there was a flash flood that impacted residential businesses, homes, and governmental properties. And the extreme weather incident produced historic rainfall and flooding in flood-prone and non-traditional locations. The district storm management system was unable to convey the magnitude, causing hazardous backflow into structures. And some of the things that HCMA did, HCMA coordinated recovery and response actions to ascertain the scope and the details. So we did things like we had post-emergency canvassing operations. We went door to door and we talked to residents who were impacted. We conducted targeted community outreach and engagement. So we conducted a mayor's walk in the different areas, in the areas that were affected by the flooding. We had set up checkpoints and informational sites at different rec centers. We went to ANC meetings and civic association meetings of the residents, neighborhoods that were impacted. We facilitated cleanups in the areas, and we evaluated the viability of applying to federal recovery programs. And those are some of the things when you say how did we respond, that we came up with after the September 10th flooding. And then one of the main objectives that came out of that was to develop the centralized flood reporting system, because as many of you know, like we talked about before, there was residents calling different either DC Water, government entities, trying to figure out who to call during a flood. So one of the tasks that we were tasked at HCMA was to help work with DC Water and 311 to develop the centralized flood reporting system, to have a centralized calling system in place for when those type of things happen. So that's basically what we have here. Vermisi, did you want to add anything?
Hi there. I guess just to kind of connect some of the work that we're doing based off of what has September 10th. As Wes shared through those canvassing efforts, a lot was brought to our attention, and some of the project ideas that we're working on in Category 9 are being came and bubbled up from that event. In particular, the project that we're working with DDOT on with the flood signs and sensors, as well as the work that DC Water is doing with the back valve program, and trying to leverage federal funding through the competitive process through one of the FEMA grants. We're definitely that was submitted in January. So just connecting the dots, kind of showing, as Emily had shared, like the foundational emergency planning and how that leads all the way up to an event, as we call it, and then leads into the recovery, and then leads into trying to mitigate the risk and reduce risk as we can. So just showing you that full picture, but definitely appreciate you all hearing more about that. And if you have any questions, we're more than happy to add to the conversation.
Thank you, Vermecia. Thank you for bringing your team together to present and give some updates, and also some call to action here on participating on moving this forward with the emergency operations part. So thanks a lot. We appreciate it.
No problem, and we'll make sure to add any additional feedback as Emily had shared and Wes. But thank you again.
Yeah, and then we'll this flood task force, DOEE and DC Water team will push out that information to the complete task force so that people can respond and participate in making sure that this part of the emergency planning piece is really attended to as well. So
Yes.
thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so let's go to the next slide. All right, so
Actually,
we're gonna
real
yes, go
quick,
ahead,
I
Nick.
wanna ask HCMA. Actually, AJ, can you go to the slide at the very beginning of HCMA's presentation where it shows Category 9? I'm just wondering, yeah, perfect. I'm wondering if that anything that we've heard today, if it makes sense to add or edit some of these actions. One thing that comes to mind is it sounds like there needs to be some playbooks, service plans, mission plans created for around flooding. And I know you plan to do them, which is awesome, but we can also give ourselves credit for, we could put them in this list, and it'd be a quick win for us as part of the task force. Anything like that?
I was just sending you an email, and we'll send an email on the same topic.
Okay.
It's a great idea.
Yeah, I mean, and then it sounds like, just on that last slide, Wes was bringing up like the DDOT flood warning signs. That's on an action. That's an action that we have already, and also the centralized system for flood complaints. We have that one as an action also. So I mean, it sounds like some of this we've already kind of captured, but just wanted to see if there's anything else you could think of, Vermecia and HCMA team, that is like very clear that you guys want to be working on, and we can just add it.
Yeah, just to echo what Emily was sharing regarding, well, actually, I'm sorry, Stacy and Meredith, regarding the exercise that's happening this in the next couple of months. That's definitely in the pipeline, and that's really connected to 9.2 and that we have here. So that definitely is something that we could add to the list. A really ambitious goal that we kind of thought through, but I guess I should put us on the spot. Actually, Annie Graff, she had thought, wouldn't it be great for Flood Week to visually show like a video of some of that work that's being done in the background, and kind of explain the story. I don't want to take all of her ideas. So that was just a high level of something she had mentioned that would be great, and something that we would love to share with as a success for the task force. But that's something immediately that's happening this quarter. If you guys,
This is Julia Coster. Vermesia is still there. On just looking at this list, is the idea for the early warning systems, it says for residents, and then there's another one that's about alerting drivers. Is this focused more on neighborhoods and residential areas, or is it, I'm thinking that when we have these really severe, very interior flooding events, it affects WMATA, it affects roads, it affects neighborhoods and local businesses, and then it also affects the downtown. And so is your approach kind of to all of those things, or is it more to help the neighborhoods?
you're referring to the, sorry, hi there, the number 9.3, install the flashing warning signs. Is that what?
That and the early warning system for residents. But I was thinking maybe we need a little flashing beep on some of our metro tunnel entrances so people don't go up or down, or and I know this issue of early warning was a big one for federal agencies in the Federal Triangle area and some of the businesses in that area. So I just was trying to figure out if you were focused more on the neighborhoods or everywhere.
Yeah, Julia. So DDOT and DOEE, we actually were working through a list of through DDOT's, they had done a flood analysis of some locations that they had were high risk in the right of way. We talked about it, some of the locations, and I know Meredith had provided some adjustments to those locations. So we are waiting to get an understanding from DDOT on the list, the prioritization list, but it's essentially about 20 or so locations that they have identified through their flood mitigation response process once an incident happens. So we're still thinking through the locations. You did bring up a great point about other stakeholders that potentially can have a similar need. And so that definitely is something that could be added to the category. This one was more so geared around DDOT's right away. So, but that's definitely something that should be considered. That probably be not something that's underway, but something we definitely can work towards with this task force.
Great, thank you. I just, I was also thinking of sites like Canal Road, which I think that's DDOT, right?
Yeah, that's on the list. Yeah.
But it has, like Park Service.
Which one you said again? I'm sorry.
Canal Road or Constitution or Madison downtown.
Yeah, the Canal Road definitely is on that list. I don't, let me confirm, and I can send you the list that we as we know it. And I can add it to Monty, if you don't mind, I can add it to your slide deck. When you if that's best. But yeah, the listing is still in the process of being prioritized by DDOT. But yes, Canal is on that list.
All right.
Hey, Vermesia, quick question. I know when we look at 9.1, it says implement an early severe warning system for residents. Does that also, I think that also means like sending out alerts to, phones and messages to stay away from certain areas that may be, flooded. It's for neighborhoods and it's for, drivers or people in that area. If that's correct.
No, you're right. And our team, Nick and Salil, if we were hoping potentially sharing more on that, because it's not really implement, it's enhancing and getting the similar feedback that we got today. Emily and Wes can share, like, this is very helpful. So just getting feedback on that. So just having this group, coming back to this group and sharing more about the alert system and Alert DC and how that is, and how we send out alerts, how we work with the office of the mayor's office to coordinate with all the PIOs in the district, and how those messages are laid out. I know Carolyn that was something that she had suggested from HCMA. And so we're more than happy to kind of share that to the group and get that same kind of valuable feedback that we received today, for just to continue coordination and improvements.
For me, absolutely right. Well, we were hoping we could get that done for this meeting, but we didn't quite make it. So it'll be on the next couple of action team meetings.
Yeah, I made a note on the potential agenda items.
No problem. We're ready. We're excited to share and get more feedback. I know. So thank you so much.
Right. So I think I'm going to say goodbye to you again, Vermesia. I don't know, but maybe somebody else might call you back up. I think that this was great that we had a chance to really dig into some of the issues that HCMA is working on, from a, kind of after the storm effect, which is all a part of the planning, right? You have to have a plan for every aspect of it, whether it be proactive, and then also there's some reactive things that we have to do in planning. So it's great that we have this a part of the priority of conversation, and I'm so happy that you all presented a lot of great details that kept us talking for a long time to engage in what your thoughts are as well. So hopefully we will wrap it up post-meeting with a couple of emails and lists to be filled out. And also, I know Alan brought up a few things that are action plans as well, so that will bring us to our closeout. So Meredith, do you want to do your thing about the homework?
I can actually jump in here.
Okay, great.
Homework. Yeah. Okay, so the first one shouldn't be a surprise. This is what Alan kind of talked about at the top of the list. So, please do go to that spreadsheet. And if you don't have a link, send an email to me or anyone on the task force, and we'll make sure you have the link. And we do need the projects as soon as possible so that we can start to organize everything a little bit better and figure out a better way to come back to the team with an approach on how to prioritize. So the second thing is draft action plans for Greenlight projects. So in that same spreadsheet on one of the tabs, there's residential resilience. There's also a governance and coordination. And if there's a green row, it means the task force has given you the thumbs up to start actually drafting your action plan. We've sent a template for you guys to use, and we encourage you to actually start work on that. The DOE team has been drafting away on some of our responsible action plans, and I think we actually need to present them at the May task force meeting, because we only have 4 full task force meetings left, and we have potentially over 20 action plans. So in order to give the task force enough time to digest and think about and ask questions on each of the action plans, we're going to need to spread out the presentation of those throughout. So DOE and DC Water are going to be the guinea pigs in presenting to the task force, and it can also be a good way for you guys to see how we're thinking about it too. But I would recommend starting work on those as soon as you can, because there'll be other actions that we haven't greenlighted, or greenlit, I guess. Unsure of how to say that, but there'll be others that we won't have the thumbs up for a couple months, and so but when we do get those, we'll need to move fast. So you don't want to be working on the earlier ones. And then lastly, just kind of a heads up to the agencies that are involved in the drainage committee. So that's DDOT, DOE, DCRA, DPW, I feel like I'm missing one. Stacy Water. Yeah. How could I forget? Just a heads up that we're gonna try and meet with all of those agencies and specifically the people that work on the drainage committee to just get some background information, kind of learn a little bit more about what's working, what's not, so that we can see if we can come up with some action ideas. Because this, specifically the drainage committee and interacting with residents who are experiencing flooding, that was a very clear place of frustration, I think, for the residents that we heard in the listening sessions, but also we just know from the amount of emails that we get. So we'll want to focus on that over the next month, but also I think kind of report out at potentially the next action team meeting. So in the next slide, right. So we've got the next task force meeting in just a little under a month. And we'll be doing the typical action team progress reports. But like I also mentioned, I think we're going to want to present some draft action plans. So I don't know, this kind of, when we figured out we needed to start presenting action plans, it was kind of a surprise to me. So I'm bringing this up so that you can start to internalize that, like, this is kind of the next phase of the task force, and we're actually going to start, I think, voting, or at least at the May meeting, getting input and feedback, so that at the next meeting in July, there can actually be votes on approving action plans. So just giving that as a heads up, and then potential topics for the next governance action team meeting you see here. Potentially talking a little bit more about funding sources and funding options, potentially a little more on the drainage committee and just coordination. And I think we can add HCMA's suggestion about the early alerts for emergency response. So that's it. Anything to add, DC Water, DOE team?
No, you've captured it well.
All right, thanks. So then the last slide is just when the next meetings are. So kind of a quick turnaround for the governance and coordination, since we had a delayed meeting, but we have a full month next month, so with the task force meeting there too.
It seems like every month is a full month. March was definitely March Madness, and
Yes.
May will be actually a little bit more on pace because we're just having 3 meetings as opposed to having 5 or 6 or something like that we had last month. But so we are gonna, you'll have notifications. Again, the public is welcome to join us. We are happy to have that kind of engagement. And let's go to the next slide. I think that this might be it. If anybody else has any questions or comments to offer. That's it. So look at that. We've got 6 minutes, 6 minutes to spare. We just want to say thank you so much. Happy Earth Day. Get out there, do something for the community, for your surroundings. And we are available. If you have any questions offline, please send a note to the team here. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Happy Friday.
Wow.
Have a great weekend.
Bye.